There are moments in
romantically
Hollywood that
involved
nobody
with
talks
Dumb and
about.
Dumber
Not because they
co-star
aren't
Lauren
significant,
Holly.
but because the people who witness them aren't entirely sure how to explain what they saw. What Dave Chappelle experienced when he finally came face to face with Jim Carrey was one of those moments. And the way he's described it since, with a kind of exhausted disbelief wrapped loosely in laughter, tells you everything you need to know about just how unsettling it really was. This isn't a story about beef. It isn't a rivalry or a feud manufactured for headlines. It's something quieter and, in many ways, far more disturbing than that. It's the story of a man who went looking for one of his heroes and came back having met someone, or something, else entirely. It's about the price of genius, the madness that sometimes lives just beneath brilliance, and what happens when a performer loses the thread that connects them back to reality. To understand how that meeting happened and why it landed the way it did, you have to understand both men. You have to go back to where they started, what they built, and what it cost them to get there. Jim Carrey didn't arrive in Hollywood polished and ready. He arrived desperate, hungry, and carrying the kind of emotional baggage that doesn't come from privilege. It comes from genuine hardship. He was born in Newmarket, Ontario, into a working-class family where money was never guaranteed and stability was something you chased rather than something you owned. His father, Percy, was a musician and an accountant, a man who kept trying different combinations of his talents, hoping one of them would finally hold. For a while they did, but eventually the floor gave out. When Carrey was a teenager, his family lost their home. Not in the abstract sense that people sometimes use to soften a difficult story, but literally and completely. They ended up living out of a Volkswagen van. Jim and his brother slept in a tent. The park by Lake Ontario became their backyard by necessity, not by choice. That kind of experience doesn't leave you when the circumstances change. It settles into the bones. It becomes a permanent part of how you understand the world, what you fear, what you chase, and how far you're willing to go to make sure you never end up back in that place again. When his father eventually found work at a tire factory, Jim and his brother had to earn their keep alongside him, pulling overnight shifts as janitors and security guards. A teenager with a rubber face and a desperate need to make people laugh was mopping floors at midnight. That contrast between who he felt he was supposed to be and where life had placed him drove him forward with an intensity that most people never develop, because most people are never pushed that hard. By 15, he was on stage at a Toronto comedy club called Yuck Yucks, standing next to his father, wearing a polyester leisure suit his mother had picked out, and bombing spectacularly in front of an audience that had absolutely no patience for a nervous kid doing safe impressions. It was humiliating, but humiliation, for certain kinds of people, isn't a reason to stop. It's fuel, and Carrey was the kind of person who ran entirely on that fuel. He kept going back. He sharpened the act, stripped away the things that weren't working, and slowly built something that was entirely his own. By 17, he was getting paid. By his early 20s, he was selling out venues in Canada. By the time Hollywood found him, or more accurately, by the time he found Hollywood, he was already a fully formed performer. He just hadn't been given the screen yet. When the 1990s arrived, the screen opened up completely. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective came out in 1994, and it wasn't just a hit. It was a phenomenon. Audiences had genuinely never seen anything like it. The physicality, the commitment, the way his entire body became a comedic instrument that operated on frequencies other actors couldn't reach. The Mask followed the same year. Dumb and Dumber followed that. In the span of roughly 12 months, Jim Carrey went from being a well-regarded comedian to being one of the most famous human beings on the planet. The speed of it was almost violent. But here's the thing about that kind of success when it arrives after that kind of struggle. It doesn't always settle you. Sometimes it destabilizes you in ways that are harder to see from the outside. Because the thing that drove you to succeed, the fear, the hunger, the desperate need to prove something, doesn't automatically disappear when you arrive. It just starts looking for somewhere else to go. Dave Chappelle understood struggle in his own way, though his version looked different. He grew up in a household shaped by intelligence and culture, with parents who were both educators. He had exposure to ideas, to art, to the kind of intellectual environment that either inspires you or intimidates you depending on the day. For Chappelle, it inspired him. He moved to New York at 17 to pursue comedy, and almost immediately, the city made it clear that inspiration alone wasn't going to be enough. He bombed. Repeatedly. He got heckled off stages in clubs that had seen enough mediocre sets to have absolutely no sympathy for another one. But he had something that couldn't be trained or manufactured, an authentic perspective and a refusal to perform a version of himself that wasn't real. His comedy wasn't built on characters or physical transformation. It was built on observation, honesty, and a kind of fearless specificity that made audiences feel like they were being let in on something true. As his reputation grew through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, so did his recognition of the people who had paved the road before him. Jim Carrey was one of those people. Not because their styles were similar. They weren't particularly, but because Carrey represented a kind of total commitment to the craft that Chappelle respected deeply. The willingness to go all the way, to hold nothing back, to make the performance the only thing that mattered in the room. That quality was something Chappelle admired, perhaps even aspired to in his own way. So when the opportunity came to visit the set of Man on the Moon, the 1999 biographical film in which Carrey was playing the legendary and deeply strange comedian Andy Kaufman, Chappelle was genuinely excited. The introduction came through Norm Macdonald, which gave the whole thing a sense of legitimacy, a seal of approval from someone whose judgment Chappelle trusted. This was going to be the meeting of two serious comic minds. A moment worth having. It was not that moment. What Chappelle walked into on that set was not a film production in any normal sense of the word. It was something closer to a controlled delusion, maintained collectively by everyone present. Jim Carrey was not there. Jim Carrey, as a human being with his own name and personality and way of moving through the world, had been replaced entirely by Andy Kaufman. Not a version of Andy Kaufman. Not an actor's approximation of Andy Kaufman prepared for the cameras and then set aside between takes. Andy Kaufman, fully inhabited, walking and talking and interacting with everyone on set as though the year were decades earlier, and the person inside the performance had genuinely ceased to exist. The crew had adapted. That's the part that Chappelle found almost as strange as Carrey himself. The people working on that film had reorganized their entire professional reality around the character. They call him Andy. They responded to the voice, the mannerisms, the whole constructed presence, as though it were simply the person they were dealing with every day. There was no winking at the camera, no nudging acknowledgement that, of course, this was Jim Carrey beneath it all. The performance had been ratified as reality by everyone in the room. And then Chappelle walked in, and he could see, clearly and immediately, that this was Jim Carrey. Whatever everyone else was pretending, whatever collective agreement had been reached about how to navigate the situation, it was obvious to him. The face was Jim Carrey's face. The physical presence was Jim Carrey's physical presence. But the moment he entered that space, the unspoken expectation was that he would fall in line with everyone else, that he would address the character, engage with the fiction, and spend however long he was there essentially acting in a scene he'd never rehearsed for and never agreed to be in. He played along. What else could he do? You don't walk onto someone else's film set and immediately break whatever strange contract holds the whole thing together. You adapt. You navigate. But what Chappelle later made clear was that adapting didn't mean he was comfortable, and navigating didn't mean he wasn't deeply unsettled by what he was experiencing. He spent an entire afternoon talking to Andy Kaufman, an entire afternoon performing a kind of social theater for the benefit of someone who had decided that their own identity was temporarily optional. The humor he's used when telling the story since then doesn't fully conceal what sits beneath it. He had gone to meet Jim Carrey. He had wanted that meeting, and what he got instead was a masterclass in what happens when dedication crosses a line and becomes something else. Something that looks less like art and more like disappearance. The Man on the Moon production is now somewhat legendary in Hollywood circles for the extremity of what happened on set. Carrey has spoken about it himself with a kind of awed bewilderment, as though he's describing something that happened to someone he used to know. He wasn't method acting in the traditional sense of the phrase. He was doing something that went further than most actors are willing to go, and probably further than most people should go. He has described the experience as one in which Jim Carrey essentially stopped existing. Not metaphorically, not as a performance choice that he could step in and out of when it suited him. The person he was before the cameras rolled became inaccessible while filming was underway. Andy Kaufman, or more specifically, Carrey's channeling of Kaufman's spirit, took up all available space. The result on screen is remarkable. The performance earned Carrey a Golden Globe and is widely considered one of the most committed portrayals in modern film history. But remarkable results and reasonable processes are not the same thing. And the people who had to work alongside that process weren't always experiencing the remarkable result. They were experiencing the daily reality of a person who had made himself largely unavailable as a person. Director Milos Forman and others connected to the production have described the tension that built up over the course of filming. There were moments of genuine conflict, situations where the line between Carrey and Kaufman became impossible to locate, and where the consequences of that blurring landed on real people who hadn't signed up to be characters in someone else's psychodrama. The dedication was real. The talent was real. But so was the cost. Chris Smith, who directed Jim and Andy, the documentary that chronicles the making of Man on the Moon, describes sitting with Carrey years later and watching footage from the production and seeing Carrey himself struggle to fully account for what the person on screen was doing. There was a distance there, a genuine uncertainty about the relationship between the man being interviewed and the figure captured in the archival footage. That's not a performance choice. That's something more complicated. What makes Chappelle's account particularly resonant is what it reveals about the difference between admiring someone's work and encountering the person behind it. These are not always the same experience. The qualities that make an artist extraordinary, the obsessive commitment, the willingness to dissolve boundaries, the refusal to do things halfway, are the same qualities that can make them extraordinarily difficult to actually be around. Genius and reasonableness are not always traveling companions. Chappelle built his own legend on authenticity, on being exactly who he was, no more and no less, and trusting that honesty to do the work. His approach to comedy was never about transformation or disappearance. It was about presence, specificity, and the courage to say the thing clearly without hiding behind a character. So what he encountered that afternoon on the Man on the Moon set was essentially the philosophical opposite of everything he believed about how performance was supposed to work. His discomfort wasn't simply about being made to play along with an unusual situation. It was about something more fundamental. The idea that a performer could go so completely into a role that the actual human being, with their own responsibility to the people around them, their own social obligations, their own basic accountability, simply opted out. That the craft could become an excuse to be absent from your own life, while everyone else was required to pretend you were present. That's a subtle but important distinction, and it's the one that gives Chappelle's account its particular edge. Because he wasn't criticizing the performance. He was questioning something about the person, about the choice, whether conscious or not, to use the performance as a place to hide from the ordinary requirements of being a human being interacting with other human beings. Jim Carrey has spent much of his later public life talking about identity, about the self, about the ways in which the version of us that we present to the world